It was a bright afternoon in the heart of the city. The streets were alive with the hum of traffic, people rushing in and out of shops, and children tugging on their parents' hands as they made their way through the sidewalks. Among the crowd walked a young woman, her presence almost impossible to ignore. She wasn't trying to stand out, she wore a simple dress and carried a small shoulder bag, but there was something about her that caught attention. She moved with quiet confidence, the kind of grace that made strangers turn their heads for just a second longer than usual. As she walked down the busy street, she stopped now and then to glance at the display windows. A bookshop caught her eye, and she slowed her steps, smiling faintly at the collection of old novels stacked behind the glass. She wasn't rushing anywhere, she had time to wander and enjoy the ordinary details of city life. But the peace of her afternoon was soon disturbed. Two police officers standing near the corner noticed her. At first, their eyes followed her casually, the way people often do when someone striking walks by. But then, as she paused again to adjust the strap of her bag, one of the officers leaned toward the other with a smirk. They shared a laugh, then began walking in her direction. The young woman didn't notice them right away. She was busy fishing a pen out of her bag, scribbling something in a small notebook she carried. But when she finally looked up, she found herself face to face with the two men in uniform. "Afternoon, miss," one of them said, tilting his head as if studying her. His tone carried an edge, not quite friendly. "Good afternoon," she replied politely, her voice calm and soft. The other officer stepped a little closer. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone sharper than necessary. She blinked, slightly surprised at the question. "I'm just walking," she answered honestly. "Enjoying the afternoon." The first officer chuckled. "Walking, huh? All alone?" His words were followed by a glance at his partner, and the two exchanged another knowing smirk. The young woman kept her expression neutral. She wasn't afraid, but she could feel the mood shifting. A few passers-by slowed down, glancing curiously at the scene. "Can we see some ID?" the second officer asked suddenly. Her brows furrowed slightly. "Is there a reason you need it?" she asked. The officer shrugged. "Just routine. You never know these days. Gotta make sure everything checks out." She held his gaze for a moment. Something about the way he spoke told her this wasn't really about routine. Still, she remained composed. "I'm just out for a walk," she said again, her voice steady. "I don't think I've done anything wrong." The first officer gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "We didn't say you did anything wrong. But it's always good to cooperate, don't you think?" Their words hung in the air, drawing more attention from people nearby. A mother tugged her child's hand and moved a little quicker past the scene, while a group of young men stopped a few feet away, pretending to check their phones but clearly watching closely. The young woman glanced around briefly. She could feel the eyes of strangers on her, but none of them dared to step in. She took a quiet breath and looked back at the officers. "I understand," she said gently, "but I also know my rights. I don't have to give you my ID without a proper reason." Her calmness seemed to irritate them. The second officer's smile faded, and his tone grew firmer. "Listen, miss, we're just doing our job. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The first officer crossed his arms, standing tall as if to emphasize his authority. "Exactly. Just show us your ID, and we'll be on our way. Unless, you've got something to hide." The crowd murmured quietly at that remark. The tension in the air thickened. The woman's heart beat a little faster, but she didn't let it show. She stood with quiet dignity, her notebook still in her hand, the pen resting between her fingers. "I don't have anything to hide," she said softly, "but respect goes both ways." For a moment, there was silence. The officers exchanged looks, clearly unused to someone answering them so calmly. Their usual tactic of intimidation didn't seem to work here. but instead of stepping back, they decided to press harder. "Come on, miss," the second officer said, his voice rising slightly. "Why don't you stop playing games and hand it over? Unless you want us to think you're up to something." Her lips curved into the faintest smile, though her eyes stayed serious. "You may regret speaking to me like this," she said quietly. It wasn't a threat, more like a gentle reminder. The officers laughed again, brushing off her words. "Regret? Us," one of them said. "I don't think so." By now, more people had gathered around, curious to see how the situation would unfold. A few even lifted their phones, holding them low to record. The atmosphere was uneasy, yet charged with anticipation. The woman stood there, her calm presence contrasting sharply with the officer's growing impatience. She wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't going to reveal who she really was, not yet. For her, this wasn't just about herself. It was about the principle of the moment. She wanted to see how far they would go when they thought they held power over someone they assumed had none. So, she stayed composed, meeting their eyes without flinching, her quiet dignity shining brighter than their authority. The afternoon crowd waited, the officers pressed, and the young woman held her ground, never once letting them see fear. What they didn't know yet was that their actions would soon come back to haunt them in ways they could never have imagined. The young woman stood quietly, her notebook still in her hand, as the two officers continued to circle her like watchful hawks. The crowd had grown larger now. People from the nearby cafe had stepped outside, some curious, others concerned. A young man on a bicycle slowed to watch, his phone angled in their direction. The whispers in the air were growing louder, but no one spoke directly to the officers. Everyone waited, uncertain about how far this would go. One of the officers, clearly impatient, stepped closer, his shadow falling across her. "All right, miss," he said firmly, "this has gone on long enough. Show us your ID. No more delays." The young woman raised her head, meeting his eyes with calm steadiness. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I already told you. I have done nothing wrong. Why do you insist on treating me this way?" Her words seemed to hang in the space between them. For a moment, even the bystanders felt the weight of her question. But instead of answering, the second officer chuckled, as if trying to brush off her calm challenge. "Look," he said, pointing to her bag, "you're carrying that notebook, walking around like you're taking notes. Who knows what you're up to? Maybe it's suspicious. We can't just let things slide, can we?" The crowd shifted uneasily. A woman in the audience muttered softly, "She's just walking. That's not suspicious." But her voice was drowned out by the officer's next words. "Give us your ID, miss," he said again, this time with an edge of impatience. "If you're really just out for a walk, you shouldn't have a problem proving it." The young woman drew a slow breath. She could feel their determination pressing against her calm, but she still refused to let frustration show. Instead, she answered softly, almost as if she were speaking to the entire crowd rather than just the two men. "It isn't about whether I can prove who I am," she said. "It's about why I should need to, when I've done nothing at all." Some of the onlookers nodded in agreement. A student holding a coffee cup whispered to his friend, "She's right." But the officers didn't notice, or perhaps didn't care. The first officer's jaw tightened. "Enough of this," he muttered. He extended his hand toward her as though expecting her to place her identification in it immediately. For the first time, the young woman looked slightly tired. She had tried to remain patient, but she knew they would not back down. Slowly, she reached into her bag. The crowd held its breath, expecting a quick end to the standoff. But before she could pull out her wallet, the second officer spoke again, his tone mockingly light. "There you go. See? That wasn't so hard, was it? Some people just like to make things difficult." Her hand paused. She looked up at him, her calm eyes filled with quiet disappointment. Then, without a word, she continued and finally withdrew her wallet. She flipped it open with steady hands and slid out her ID card. The first officer snatched it quickly, almost too quickly, as though eager to prove his authority one last time. He glanced at it casually, then froze. The second officer, noticing the sudden change in his partner's face, frowned. "What is it?" he asked. The first officer's eyes darted from the card to the young woman's face and back again. His expression shifted from arrogance to disbelief, then to alarm. His partner, growing impatient, leaned over and grabbed the card from his hand. The moment his eyes scanned the name, his confident smirk vanished. He blinked rapidly, his lips parting as though words had escaped him. He turned to the young woman, his voice suddenly unsteady. "Wait, you're..." The young woman gave a small nod, confirming without needing to explain. A hush fell over the crowd. Those standing closest leaned in, curious, whispering the name they had overheard. It passed from one person to another until the entire group seemed to know, she was the governor's daughter. The officers looked at each other, panic rising in their eyes. The ID card trembled slightly in the second officer's hand as he quickly returned it to her, his earlier boldness nowhere to be found. The young woman took it back calmly, slipping it into her wallet as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Her poise stood in sharp contrast to the sudden unease of the officers, whose bravado had melted into nervousness. "Miss, we didn't realize," the first officer began, his voice cracking slightly. The second one jumped in hurriedly, his words spilling over one another. Of course. Please forgive us. We were only doing our duty. You understand, right? We never meant..." The young woman's eyes held theirs, steady and calm. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't scold. But her silence alone carried more weight than any lecture could have. The bystanders, sensing the shift, began murmuring louder. A man in the crowd said clearly, "Funny how polite they got once they found out who she is." Others nodded in agreement, some even chuckling softly at the irony of the scene. The officers, growing red-faced, tried desperately to regain control. "Is there anything we can do for you, miss?" one asked quickly. "Perhaps we can escort you, make sure you're safe." The young woman tilted her head slightly, her calm gaze almost pitying. "Safe?" she asked softly. "Do you think I was unsafe a moment ago?" The question stung. The officers looked down, unable to answer. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were judging, silently holding the officers accountable with their eyes. The phones that had been recording earlier now seemed like quiet witnesses that would not forget. The young woman let the silence linger. She didn't need to say much more. With quiet dignity, she turned slightly, as though ready to continue her walk. But before she stepped away, she spoke once more, her voice gentle yet firm enough for all to hear. "Respect should not depend on who someone's family is," she said. "It should be given to every person, in every place." Her words settled over the street like a soft but powerful echo. The crowd nodded, some even clapping softly in agreement. The officers stood frozen, their earlier authority completely gone, replaced by the weight of embarrassment and fear of what might come next. The young woman began walking again, leaving behind a stunned silence. But the story was far from over, for now, the whole city would soon hear about what had taken place on that street corner. The silence after her words was heavy, as if the entire street was holding its breath. The young woman walked a few steps forward, her calm footsteps echoing softly against the pavement. The officers, however, stood frozen in place, their authority suddenly shattered by the truth of her identity. For the first time that afternoon, they looked smaller, no longer towering figures of power but men who had been unmasked in front of strangers. The crowd buzzed with whispers, voices carrying the news from one person to the next. "She's the governor's daughter," someone said loudly enough for others to hear. Did you see the way they were treating her? Phones were still recording, and a few bold onlookers even stepped closer, capturing the officer's nervous expressions. What had begun as a moment of intimidation had now become a public spectacle. The young woman, though calm, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her. Yet, she did not rush. She walked with dignity, each step deliberate, as if she were fully aware that this moment was no longer about her alone. The first officer finally found his voice. "Wait, miss, please," he called out, taking a hesitant step toward her. His tone was no longer sharp but pleading, almost desperate. We didn't mean any harm. Please understand." She stopped and turned her head slightly, just enough to look back at him. Her face was serene, but her silence pressed down on him more than any words could. The second officer, who only moments ago had mocked her calmness, now fidgeted with his hat, his voice trembling. If anyone misunderstood our intentions, we're truly sorry," he stammered. His words were directed not only at her but at the watching crowd. The bystanders were no longer passive. A man in a business suit raised his voice. "You weren't misunderstood," he said clearly. "We all saw how you spoke to her." Others murmured in agreement, some shaking their heads in disapproval. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Their badges, once symbols of authority, now felt heavy on their chests. They knew the situation had slipped far beyond their control. Meanwhile, the young woman remained calm. She did not rush to use her identity as a weapon. Instead, she let the truth speak for itself. She understood the weight of her position, but she also knew this was a moment to show what true dignity looked like. She looked directly at the two men and said softly, "What if I had not been who I am? Would you have continued treating me that way?" The question struck them like a stone. Neither could answer. Their silence was enough for the crowd, which reacted with more murmurs of agreement. Some people even clapped lightly, as though supporting her quiet strength. The officers glanced at one another, their faces pale. They realized the crowd wasn't on their side anymore. Their authority had dissolved into shame, and every passing second made it worse. The young woman, seeing their discomfort, finally turned to the crowd. Her voice was steady, not loud, but it carried. "You all saw what happened," she said. "This should not happen to anyone, not just to me." Her words stirred something in the people around her. A woman with a stroller nodded, speaking softly to the stranger beside her. "She's right. Respect shouldn't depend on who your father is." The second officer tried once more to salvage the moment. "Please, miss, allow us to make it right. We can escort you, ensure your safety." The young woman tilted her head gently, her eyes full of quiet disappointment. "Safety is not given when someone already feels threatened," she replied. The crowd's reaction grew stronger. More people raised their voices now. "Exactly," one man said. "They only changed their tone when they saw her ID." Others agreed, pointing out the unfairness of the treatment they had just witnessed. The first officer's nerves began to show more clearly. He rubbed his neck, his words stumbling. We didn't know. If we had known." Her calm interruption was sharp in its truth. "But you should not need to know." That single sentence silenced him again. The crowd applauded softly, their approval clear. The officers lowered their heads, aware that no explanation could erase what had been seen. The young woman looked around at the faces of the bystanders. Some were young, some old, but all of them were united by the shared experience of witnessing unfairness. She could see it in their eyes, the mix of admiration for her calmness and frustration at the misuse of authority. She knew that this moment was bigger than her. It wasn't just about being the governor's daughter. It was about every person who might face such treatment without a powerful name to protect them. The atmosphere was shifting. What began as a scene of intimidation was now transforming into a lesson, a story that would ripple far beyond this street. People would talk about it later in offices, in cafes, in their homes. The videos being recorded would find their way online, sparking discussions about fairness, respect, and accountability. The officers realized this too. Their panic was not only about her identity but also about the consequences they could no longer control. They imagined the videos spreading, their faces recognized, their actions questioned by superiors and the public alike. The second officer whispered urgently to his partner, "We need to end this now. The more we stand here, the worse it gets." But ending it was no longer in their hands. The young woman stood before them like a quiet mirror, reflecting their behavior back at them. And the crowd had already judged. Taking a final breath, she decided to step forward once more, but this time she walked not away from the officers but past them, her presence commanding the street. The crowd parted gently, allowing her space. People moved aside with respect, some nodding to her as she passed. She did not look back at the officers again. She didn't need to. Their panic, their shame, and their sudden loss of confidence told the entire story without another word. As she continued walking, the bystanders followed with their eyes, the street unusually quiet except for the faint sounds of traffic in the distance. The tension had broken, replaced by a sense of reflection. The young woman's steps were steady, unhurried. She carried herself with the same calm dignity she had shown from the beginning. And though the officers remained behind, shrinking into the background, everyone knew the story was far from over. The crowd dispersed slowly, people talking to each other in low voices. Some still recorded, making sure to capture every last moment. Others shared their thoughts with strangers, bonded by what they had witnessed. And somewhere inside, the young woman knew this was not the end. The incident would soon reach ears far beyond this street, and the officer's panic was only the beginning of a larger reckoning. For now, though, she simply walked on, the afternoon sun casting a soft glow on her path, while the whispers of justice followed behind her like an echo. The officers stood in the middle of the street, their uniforms no longer carrying the same weight they had a few minutes ago. Their faces were pale, their shoulders heavy, and their words scattered as they tried to piece together explanations that no one was asking for anymore. The young woman had already walked several steps away, but the storm of their actions was only beginning to swirl around them. The bystanders, who had at first been silent observers, were now finding their voices. A man in his 40s, still holding his phone steady, called out, "We've got everything recorded. Everyone saw how you treated her." The officers turned sharply, their nervous smiles breaking through. "Sir, please," one of them said, his voice shaking. "It's not what it looks like. We were just doing a routine check." But the crowd wasn't buying it. A teenager in a red hoodie lifted his phone higher, recording the officer's every word. "Routine check?" he asked sarcastically. "She was just walking. You wouldn't let her go. You didn't act routine, you acted rude." The murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping, questions rising like waves. "Why did you keep pushing her? Why were you laughing? Would you have stopped if she wasn't who she is?" The officer's hands fidgeted by their sides. One tried to adjust his belt, the other ran a hand across his forehead, wiping sweat that wasn't from the sun. Their power was slipping away not only because of who she was, but because the people had seen everything with their own eyes. The young woman stopped again, turning just enough to look at the scene. She wasn't angry. She wasn't shouting. Her calm presence, even at a distance, made their panic worse. It was as if her silence had become the sharpest reminder of their actions. "Miss Governor's daughter," the first officer stammered, trying to soften his voice. We sincerely apologize for earlier. It was a mistake. Truly." The second officer nodded quickly, eager to echo his partner. "Yes, yes. We only meant to ensure safety. We had no idea, but the young woman's gentle interruption cut through their excuses. That is the point, she said softly. You should not need to know. The crowd clapped lightly, approving her words. The officers flinched at the sound. A woman with a stroller spoke up boldly now. She's right. Respect isn't for the powerful alone. It's for everyone. The officers exchanged a helpless glance. The crowd, which had once been passive, was now the jury, and their verdict was clear. The two men, once symbols of authority, were standing on trial in the open street. The panic deepened when another man stepped forward, a tall figure in a business shirt. He held his phone high and said firmly, "I'm sending this video straight to the press. People need to see this." The officers' eyes widened. Their earlier arrogance had completely melted into desperation. "Wait, sir, please, there's no need for that," one said quickly. His voice cracked as he spoke, trying to sound calm but failing. But it was too late. People were already sharing, their fingers moving rapidly on their screens. The videos, the voices, the expressions, it was all being sent beyond the street, traveling across the invisible network of the city. The young woman's gaze softened. She did not smile, nor did she gloat. She simply let it happen, because she knew this was no longer in her hands. The truth was out, and the world would decide what to do with it. The first officer, feeling the pressure closing in, tried one last attempt. "Miss, please, allow us to make it up to you. We can escort you, ensure you get home safely. We can explain everything to your father." She raised her hand gently, stopping him mid-sentence. Her voice remained calm, like a steady stream of water. "My father does not need an explanation. The people do." Her words fell like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the crowd. The applause grew louder this time, not in anger but in agreement. The officers stood frozen, their lips pressed together, their eyes darting to the ground. The atmosphere had transformed completely. The crowd was no longer intimidated, the officers were. The balance of power had shifted, and the people were on the side of the woman who had remained graceful throughout. One man leaned close to his friend and whispered, "Imagine their faces when the governor hears about this." The officers imagined it too, and the thought made their stomachs twist. Their earlier boldness seemed foolish now, a memory they wished they could erase. Panic wasn't just written on their faces, it was in the way they shuffled their feet, in the way their words stumbled, in the way they avoided meeting the crowd's eyes. The young woman turned back fully this time, facing them once more. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She simply spoke the truth aloud so that everyone could hear. "You wanted to see my ID," she said softly. "Now everyone has seen your true face." The crowd reacted with a collective murmur, some nodding, some whispering, all agreeing. It was no longer about names or titles. It was about fairness, dignity, and the quiet strength of one woman against misused authority. The officers swallowed hard, their earlier confidence now completely gone. They knew this moment would follow them. Their panic wasn't only about the governor's daughter, it was about accountability that could no longer be avoided. The young woman, having said enough, turned once more to continue her walk. The crowd stepped aside respectfully, making way for her like she was more than just a person, she was a symbol of truth standing against unfairness. The officers remained behind, their figures shrinking against the backdrop of whispers, phones, and disapproving stares. The world around them had changed in a single afternoon, and their panic only deepened with every second they stood there, realizing that nothing they said could erase what had already been seen. The city would hear of this. The videos would spread. And soon, the walls of their own station would echo with the questions of those above them. For now, though, all they could do was stand silently in the middle of the street, while the young woman's calm dignity walked farther and farther away, leaving them behind with their regret. The sun had begun to tilt westward, casting long shadows across the busy street. The young woman walked steadily, each step quiet yet powerful. Behind her, the crowd slowly broke apart, though many still whispered about what they had seen. Some replayed their recordings, shaking their heads at the way the officers had behaved before realizing who she was. Others began typing quickly, sharing the videos online with captions that carried their thoughts: "Respect should not depend on status." Within minutes, the story spread beyond the street. Phones buzzed, notifications chimed, and the incident started moving from one person to another, first in the city, then far wider. What had been just an ordinary afternoon walk for one woman had turned into a lesson the whole community was about to learn. The young woman, however, did not rush. She made her way calmly through the city, passing cafes, bookstores, and offices, her expression steady. Inside, she reflected on what had just happened. She had never wanted to use her father's name as a shield. She had wanted to live as any ordinary person would, free to walk the streets, to enjoy the small joys of life without being treated differently. Yet the incident had reminded her how quickly respect could vanish when people judged only by appearances. By the time she reached her car, parked quietly in a side street, her phone buzzed. Messages poured in: friends who had seen the videos, journalists asking for comments, and even her father's assistant reaching out. She placed the phone down gently, choosing silence over noise for the moment. She knew the truth of what had happened would speak louder than any interview she could give. Meanwhile, the officers were left standing in the center of the street, uncertain what to do next. Their earlier arrogance had dissolved into a storm of panic. They knew the videos were out there, that the faces of the crowd had turned against them, and that sooner or later their superiors would hear about every detail. Their uniforms, once a source of pride, now felt heavy with shame. As the evening wore on, news channels began picking up the story. Clips of the confrontation appeared on television screens and online feeds. Commentators repeated the young woman's words: respect should not depend on who someone's family is. It should be given to every person. Viewers nodded, many feeling the truth in those words deep in their hearts. Families at dinner tables discussed it. "Imagine if that were you," parents said to their children. "How would you feel being treated that way?" Students talked about it in groups, debating fairness and authority. Even those who did not know the governor or his daughter personally felt connected to the lesson. It was not just about one person. It was about everyone. The governor himself, when told of the incident, did not react with anger. He did not call for punishment out of pride or power. Instead, he spoke softly, his voice calm yet firm: "My daughter was right. Respect must be universal. Let this be a reminder." His words were shared in newspapers the next day, adding weight to the message that had already touched so many. The two officers, however, faced consequences they had not expected. Their actions were reviewed by their department. The recordings left no room for denial. They had to sit through questions, explanations, and the uncomfortable silence of their own mistakes being replayed again and again on screen. For them, it was a lesson carved deeply, one they would carry long after the headlines faded. But the young woman did not seek revenge. She did not gloat or celebrate their downfall. Instead, she chose to remain quiet, her calm dignity continuing even after the noise around her grew. For her, the victory was not about punishment but about awareness. She wanted people to understand that every person deserves kindness, no matter their background, their family, or their appearance. As days passed, the story continued to ripple. It inspired community groups to speak about respect and accountability. Schools used it as an example in discussions about fairness. Even strangers who had not been there felt as though they had witnessed the lesson themselves, thanks to the power of the videos shared online. The young woman herself returned to her routines. She still walked the streets, still paused at bookshops, still carried her notebook where she wrote down quiet thoughts. Yet wherever she went now, there was a subtle shift in how people looked at her. They did not just see the governor's daughter. They saw the woman who had stood calmly against intimidation, who had reminded the city of a simple truth. Her story became one that parents told their children, one that teachers shared in classrooms, one that echoed in conversations about fairness. And though time moved forward, the memory of that afternoon remained alive. The two officers, in their own way, also carried the memory. Their panic had turned into regret, and regret into reflection. Though discipline came from their department, the deeper consequence was the change within themselves. They learned, through their own mistake, that authority without respect is empty, and that true respect cannot be forced, it must be given freely to all. In the end, the afternoon was remembered not for the officer's arrogance but for the young woman's calm dignity. Her words, spoken softly on a city street, continued to echo long after. Respect should not depend on who someone's family is. It should be given to every person, in every place. And so the story closed not with anger, but with a lesson that lingered, reminding everyone who heard it that true respect is not about power, but about humanity.